Chapter 7. Arthur. Sire, we've gone over this 100 times. You cannot leave the castle unattended, Sir Morian scolded. The brawny, bearded, dark-skinned knight paced the throne room, his long steps steeping or eating up the distance between stone walls. Arthur slumped in his throne. I said I was sorry, he muttered, a little sulkingly. But who could blame him? After all, he hadn't asked for this. All he ever aimed for in life was to maybe become a squire to a famous knight and go questing throughout the land, facing dangers untold and maybe, if they were lucky, a few dragons. Instead, he was stuck in a musty old castle, deciding the fates of random chickens and hoping he didn't accidentally start a war. It was not good to be the king. He sighed deeply, thinking back to his fleeting moment of freedom in the forest earlier that day. It had felt so good to be his old self again, the orphan wart who hadn't had a care in the world. Back when he lived to that life, he hadn't fully appreciated it. Now he'd give anything at all just to have it back, to see Guinevere again. His mind flashed to the girl he'd met in the forest. She'd been so nice to him, not caring about his social status or who his parents might be. In fact, it hadn't mattered one bit to her that he was a nobody, which, in a strange way, made him feel like a somebody worth talking to, somebody worth becoming friends with. Well, until she realized the truth. He winced as he remembered the look of shock that crossed her face when she realized he had lied to her, followed by the crushing look of betrayal. At that moment, his greatest wish on earth would have been to climb down into that deep, dark well and never come out again. He resisted the urge to slap his hand to his forehead. Oh, why had he lied to her? It was so stupid and short-sighted. Not to mention completely disrespectful to her. This was not how Merlin had taught him to be. But it didn't matter now. He supposed sadly. For he would likely never see her again. At least not without a full accompaniment of knights, which would spoil any chance of fun. Not to mention the fact that he was pretty sure she had no interest in running into him again, knights or no. His stupid lie had ruined their chance of friendship, probably forever. There was a knock at the door. Arthur rose to his feet. Come in, he commanded after throwing a quick look at Morian, thankful for a distraction to his scolding. The knight sighed deeply, shaking his head. As the door swung open for a brief moment, Arthur allowed himself to indulge in the fantasy that it would be Guinevere on the other side of it, come to the castle to give him a chance to apologize. But of course, it was not Guinevere. It was the castle steward. Your Majesty, the steward bowed low. Sir Bellinor and his men have returned from their meeting with the Saxons. They are requesting an audience with you. Arthur's heart quickened, relegating all thoughts of Guinevere to the back of his brain. Send them in, he declared. The steward bowed again and disappeared out the door. A moment later, he returned, accompanied by Pellinor, Kay, and a tall knight with broad shoulders and a shock of jet black hair, whom Bellinor introduced as Gawain. All three bowed low to Arthur. So, Arthur asked impatiently, what did they say? Bellinor straightened. His face broke into an excited smile. Your Majesty, he said, I can barely believe I'm sharing this news with you. But somehow the Saxons have agreed to your request. They are planning a trip to Camelot to attend your promised feast. Really? Arthur stared at the knights. It had worked? His plan for peace had worked? Well, not completely. Not yet. Anyway. But they'd agreed to come. That was a big step. Really, Gawain agreed with a toothy grin. Arthur liked him immediately. They're packing up now and plan to arrive at the castle in a week's time. Their king seems very eager to meet you. This is amazing, Arthur cried overjoyed. I knew this would work. Bah! Kay interrupted, shaking his head. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. Inviting these barbarians to our banquet halls to sup like they're civilized people? He scowled. It's just not done. Maybe not, but it's being done now, Arthur corrected, a little cross at being challenged, especially by his foster brother, who had always made it clear he thought he knew better, even when he clearly didn't. And who knows, maybe they'll surprise you. Or maybe they'll surprise you, Kay shot back, not missing a beat. Ever think of that? Maybe it's a trick to breach our castle walls, to learn our ways and the depths of our forces, so they can gain the upper hand when they come back to attack us at a later date. Arthur swallowed hard, his earlier enthusiasm deflating. He didn't want to admit it, but Kay did have a point. What if opening their gates in peace led to nothing but war? And worse, gave their enemies an advantage. It would be all his fault. Okay, Gawain broke in, smacking Arthur's foster brother so hard on the back that Kay almost fell over. You worry too much. By the gods, they're invited to dinner, not a behind-the-tapestries tour of the inner workings of Camelot Castle. We knights can keep an eye on a few barbarians, don't you think? Make sure they mind their manners. Exactly, Arthur agreed, thankful to Gawain for sticking up for him. We'll show them we're kind, but not stupid. Kay opened his mouth as if to speak, but a stern look from Gawain made him close it again. Instead, he crossed his meaty arms over his chest and stuck out his lower lip in a pout. Arthur resisted the urge to snicker. It wasn't often he got to see Kay put in his place, but he was a king, he reminded himself. He couldn't afford to be petty. Sir Pellinore turned to Arthur, clapping his hands. Very good, Your Majesty, he said. What would you like us to do in the meantime? Let's have the cook start working on the menus, Arthur said, and the staff need to be cleaning out the halls and guest rooms and making sure there's enough room in the stables for their horses. He listed off the various tasks, the kinds of preparations he himself was quite familiar with from when guests arrived at Sir Edgar's castle back when he worked in the kitchens. Oh, yes, we'll be sure to get right on all that, my lord, Kay jeered, making a mocking bow in Arthur's direction. Gawain sighed and gave Arthur an apologetic look before he and Pellinore led the other knight out of the throne room. Morian followed close behind. Arthur let out a breath of relief. It seemed his lecture for leaving the castle was over, and the day was finally starting to look up. He sat back in his throne, feeling rather pleased. A moment later, Archimedes flew down from his perch on the rafters above and landed on his throne armrest. Well done, lad, the owl chirped. Your first act as king, and it seems to be turning into a smashing success. Arthur smiled goofily, feeling better now that they were alone. I wasn't sure if it was going to work, he confessed. I mean, when I first decided on it, everyone seemed to think I was mad. Some still do, I suppose, he added, thinking of Kay's sneer. It's not mad, it's civilized, the owl corrected haughtily. And I'm sorry, but a knight like Kay has no room to complain about barbarians, not when he's only one step above one himself. Arthur smirked. You said it, not me. I'm proud of you, boy, the owl continued. Perhaps you will make a fine king yet. Thank you, Arthur said. That means a lot coming from you. He leant back in his throne, staring up at the ceiling thoughtfully. Do you think this was all part of Merlin's plan from the start? Do you think he knew my destiny? Was that why he agreed to teach me in the first place? So I'd know how to do this? The owl shrugged. He did say something about leading you to your rightful place, he told Arthur. Perhaps this is what he was talking about? He fluffed his feathers. I just assumed he meant to have you become his apprentice. Maybe take over for him someday. But perhaps it was more than that. I wish he were here now, Arthur sighed. It would be nice to have his advice. I know, boy, Archimedes agreed. I miss him too, he scowled. Though you better never tell him I said that. Arthur laughed. Your secret is safe with me. Archimedes took flight, making small circles around the room. I have to admit, I am getting worried about him. He's been gone a very long time, longer than I can ever remember his being gone before. Sure, he'll sometimes time travel when he's angry, but he always comes back. So where is he now? Morgan said he was on something called a holiday, Arthur told him. The owl stopped in midair, almost falling to the ground in the process. Morgan? He repeated. Who's Morgan? Morgan Le Fay? Arthur tried to remember. She's a wizard, like Merlin. She came here the day I had to rule about the chicken. She told me Merlin sent her. He wrinkled his nose. But something was very strange about her, and her advice seemed very odd, very un-Merlin-like. Morgan Le Fay, Archimedes landed back on the throne, shaking his head. Why does that name sound so familiar? I don't know, Arthur shrugged. Should we track her down again and see if she knows more about Merlin? Maybe she knows where he is. Maybe. Or maybe she's the reason he's not back yet, Archimedes suggested wordily. After all, it seems quite a coincidence that she showed up right after Merlin's disappearance. What if she did something to him? Arthur frowned. He hadn't thought of that possibility. But she was a wizard, which meant she had magic. What should we do? He asked the owl. Archimedes seemed to consider the question for a moment. Then he shook out his feathers. Let me fly back to Sir Edgar's castle, he said. Merlin's books are probably all still in the tower where he left them. Maybe I can learn something from them about this Morgan Le Fay character. Then we'll know if we can trust her or not. Arthur shuddered at the thought. Do you really think she might have done something to Merlin? He asked, nervously thinking back to his poor teacher. If anything had happened to him. I don't know, Archimedes admitted, but I plan to find out.